Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine if the history books, the ones we've relied on for centuries, were fundamentally wrong. Not because of lost artifacts or anything like that, but because we just misread the stars. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a really fascinating and, yeah, incredibly controversial theory known as the new chronology. Specifically, we'll explore how its proponents claim that major biblical texts think the book of Revelation are actually, well, disguised astronomical charts, and that this changes everything we thought we knew about when they were truly written. It's a pretty wild idea, to say the least.
It really is. And what's truly intriguing here is how this theory, which was developed by two mathematicians, Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovskiy, directly challenges the very foundations of traditional historical dating. They argue that by essentially resurrecting hidden horoscopes within these ancient texts, they can pinpoint their true composition. Not to distant antiquity, but much, much more recently. To the late Middle Ages, in fact.
Right. So our mission today is to explore these, well, audacious claims, look at the specific astronomical evidence they put forward, and see what our look into their source material reveals about their methods and, the wider historical debate around it all. Get ready for some genuinely surprising insights, I think. Let's start with the book of Revelation. Now, traditionally, it's believed Apostle John wrote it around, 95 AD?
That's the accepted date, yes.
Fomenko and Nosovskiy just tossed that date right out the window.
Completely.
They claim the apocalypse contains a precise astronomical horoscope, and when they decode it, it dates its composition to a very specific window, September 25th to October 10th, 1486. That is a massive difference. How exactly do they arrive at such a precise and much, much later date?
Okay, so they propose that many of the really vivid images you find in the apocalypse aren't abstract prophecies at all.
Yeah.
They see them as direct references to constellations and planetary positions, exactly as they were depicted on medieval star charts.
Medieval charts specifically.
Yes, that's key. For instance, they identify the throne of God and the seven spirits opposite his throne from Revelation 1. They connect that with the constellation Ursa Major, which, interestingly, was often called the Chariot of Souls back then. And they place it right near the throne constellation, which we now know as Cassiopeia.
Okay.
Then there's the figure sitting on the throne with the appearance of Jasper and Carnelian in Revelation 4. They say that's Cassiopeia itself. And on some medieval maps by artists like Dürer or Al-Sufi, Cassiopeia was actually drawn as Christ on a throne, sometimes even crucified.
Wow.
And the gemstone reference, well, they argue stars were often seen as luminous gems, so that description makes sense in that context.
And the rainbow, the emerald rainbow around the throne.
That, they say, is the Milky Way,
Okay.
the luminous strip of the Milky Way, which does sort of appear to encircle Cassiopeia on those old charts.
So the sky itself is the stage, the whole cosmic scene, and these specific figures are actually constellations. But it gets even more detailed, right? What about those really famous bits? The 24 elders, the 4 living creatures, how do they fit those into the stars?
Absolutely. It gets very specific. The 24 elders who are dressed in white with crowns of gold from Revelation 4.4. They interpret those as the 24 sidereal hours. You can think of them as like distinct segments dividing up the celestial sphere in medieval astronomy.
Okay, like time zones for the sky.
Sort of, yeah. And their golden crowns are seen as the constellation Corona Borealis, the northern crown, which is up near the zenith. The white clothing just reflects, the white light of the stars themselves.
Huh. And those 4 living creatures covered with eyes, I remember them being like a lion, an ox, a man, and a flying eagle. How do Fomenko and Nosovskiy interpret their really weird features, like having 6 wings and being covered with eyes all around? How is that astronomical?
Right, well, that's a direct mapping they make to well-known constellations. The lion is Leo. That's a zodiacal constellation. The ox is Taurus, another one from the zodiac. The human face refers to Sagittarius, often shown as a centaur. And the flying eagle is most likely Pegasus. Now, Pegasus is equatorial, aligned with Earth's equator, but it almost touches the ecliptic, the sun's path. And these 4 constellations in medieval understanding often form a kind of square or cross along that ecliptic path.
Okay.
And they claim these creatures having 6 wings and being covered with eyes. That perfectly matches how these constellations look on medieval charts. They appear with 6 sectors of direct ascension, and they're just strewn with stars or eyes.
Stars as eyes. Okay.
Then we get to the 4 horses of the apocalypse and their riders. They identify these as planets in specific constellations at that proposed time.
Ah, the planets come in now.
Exactly. So the white horse with a conqueror riding a bow in Revelation 6.2. That's Jupiter, a bright, sort of conquering planet located in Sagittarius, the archer.
Makes sense.
The red horse, with a rider holding a sword in 6.4. That's Mars, the red planet, positioned under the constellation Perseus. Specifically, they place it in Gemini or Taurus, with Perseus looking like he's standing on them.
Okay.
The black horse, with a rider holding a pair of scales in 6.56, that's Mercury, often seen as the patron of trade, located in Libra, the balance. And the text explicitly mentions trade and prices right there, which they see as reinforcing the connection.
Right, I remember that verse.
Then the pale horse, whose rider is Death and Hades follow him, in 6.8. That's the ominous planet Saturn in the constellation Scorpio. And there was a medieval belief that Saturn entering Scorpio was an omen of, well, great afflictions.
A bad sign.
A very bad sign. And finally, you have the sun in Virgo, with the moon under Virgin's feet, described in Revelation 12.1, and Venus, the morning star, is placed in Leo, connecting to the phrase, he who overcomes, from earlier in Revelation.
So Fomenko and Nosovskiy are claiming that if you take all these positions, the planets in these specific constellations as viewed from Patmos, where John supposedly was, they only line up like this on that particular date range in 1486.
That's their astronomical calculation, yes. That unique alignment is the cornerstone of their dating for Revelation.
Okay, so what are the major implications then? If they're right, or if this theory holds, what does this radical redating mean for the Bible itself and for history?
Well, if you look at the bigger picture they paint, the theory asserts the apocalypse was written just 6 years before 1492.
Why is 1492 so important here, beyond Columbus, obviously?
Right, because 1492 was widely expected in the medieval Christian world to be essentially Judgment Day, or the year 7000, since the creation of Adam.
Ah, a major apocalyptic expectation date.
Exactly. So the timing, being so close to this anticipated cataclysm, makes the book's content predicting doomsday incredibly relevant to its supposed time of composition in 1486. And as for its place in the Bible, well, this dating means Revelation would have been written later than the Gospels.
Which completely flips the traditional chronology.
It does. And it places it chronologically alongside events like the 15th century Ottoman conquest, which, in their framework, they actually refer to as the biblical Exodus.
That's a huge shift in understanding biblical history. And they even try to bolster this argument by pointing to illustrations, right, in some 16th century apocalypse manuscripts.
Yes, that's another layer. They point out illustrations that depict riders carrying things that look remarkably like muskets, and angels blowing into pipes that, well, they look an awful lot like cannons belching fire.
Which would have been contemporary technology in the late 15th century when they claim it was written.
Precisely. It's a compelling detail, they argue, suggesting the artists were reflecting their own time, their own reality, onto this text.
But couldn't that just be artists incorporating things they knew into an older story? I mean, artists do that all the time, don't they? How do Fomenko and Nosovskiy distinguish that from evidence of later composition?
That's a fair point, and a common criticism. Their counterargument is about the sheer consistency and the level of detail of these, let's call them anachronisms, across multiple medieval manuscripts. They argue that this, combined with the claimed astronomical precision, points away from simple artistic license. For them, it suggests a deep familiarity with contemporary tech and, crucially, medieval astronomy, not just by the illustrators, but by the original authors themselves. It's supporting evidence, in their view.
Okay. And it's not just the apocalypse, is it? This research also claims that many Old Testament books, despite being traditionally dated way back in antiquity, are also filled with these kinds of medieval astronomical descriptions. Let's turn to the book of Ezekiel, for example.
Right. Ezekiel is traditionally dated to the 6th century BCE, during the Babylonian exile. But Fomenko and Nosovskiy argue it also contains what they see as explicit astronomical imagery from a much later period. For instance, the very first verse, "The heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God."
They see that as literal instruction again. Look at the sky.
Pretty much. A direct instruction to observe the sky. Then you have the likeness of 4 living creatures. They have the likeness of a man in Ezekiel 1.5. They identify this with the constellation Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, which is indeed shaped like a man, and is situated right in the Milky Way on medieval maps.
Ophiuchus. Okay.
And the description of Ophiuchus having 4 wings in Ezekiel 1.6, they align that with those 24 astronomical sectors or star hours we mentioned before, the ones that divided the medieval sky.
So the same system as in Revelation.
Exactly, the same medieval framework. And Ezekiel's description of creatures resembling a lion, ox, and eagle, so Leo, Taurus, and Aquila, or maybe Pegasus in 1.10, connects again to those same zodiacal and equatorial constellations seen in the Apocalypse interpretation. They also argue that phrases like burning coals of fire and lamps refer to planets, and the zigzags mentioned describe their movements forthright and retrograde motion.
Retrograde motion, that apparent backward movement of planets, that was a big deal in pre-Copernican astronomy.
A huge deal. And they also link Ezekiel to that very specific medieval concept of planetary orbits being like concentric wheels, right?
That's right, yes. They argue that Ezekiel's famous wheels, described in chapter 10 as one wheel by one cherub and being full of eyes round about.
Those, they say, are classic medieval representations of planetary orbits around the Earth, with the orbits adorned with stars.
And the cherub.
The cherubim themselves are interpreted as chariots carrying the planets, or perhaps the planets themselves. This whole imagery, wheels within wheels, eyes, cherubim as chariots, is distinctly pre-Copernican, very geocentric, Earth at the center. They argue strongly this points to a medieval origin for the text, not something from the 6th century BCE.
Fascinating. Moving beyond Ezekiel, did they find similar patterns, similar hidden messages in other Old Testament prophecies?
Yes, they apply this lens quite broadly. The prophecy of Zechariah, for instance, gets linked to Jupiter, which they translate the name to mean the thunderer. And Zechariah includes descriptions of 4 planetary chariots, which they see as analogous to Ezekiel's wheels and cherubim.
More planetary chariots.
And the book of Jeremiah, when it describes a poised mace or a seething pot tilting from the north in Jeremiah 1.1414, that's argued to be a medieval depiction of a comet. Apparently, comets were often drawn as maces or boiling cauldrons on medieval charts.
A comet as a boiling pot. Interesting visual.
Isn't it? Even the famous writing on the wall in the book of Daniel gets an astronomical interpretation. The finger in the hand of a stately man writing on the sky. They suggest that prey refers to a comet appearing near the constellation Ophiuchus, the stately man.
It's quite striking how they find these recurring astronomical themes across so many different texts, supposedly written centuries apart. What's the bigger conclusion Fomenko and Nosovskiy draw when they connect all these dots, seeing these patterns in both the Old and New Testaments?
Well, when you step back and look at what they see as this consistency across all these biblical texts, the sophisticated astronomical descriptions, the shared medieval imagery, the distinctly geocentric worldview. From the new chronology perspective, the traditional dating, which separates these books by potentially thousands of years, just seems inconsistent. It doesn't fit. So the theory suggests these books were actually created much closer together in time, within the same paradigm of scientific ideology, as they put it, specifically sometime between the 11th and 16th centuries AD. Far, far more recently than mainstream history accepts.
Which would mean the entire biblical narrative, as we understand its development, would have been compiled and written much, much later.
That's the implication, yes.
Yeah.
A radical rewriting, not just of dating, but of the formation of the text themselves.
Okay, so this deep dive into biblical astronomy is clearly just one piece, albeit a fascinating one, of this much larger sweeping theory they call the new chronology. Give us the overview then. What is this new chronology at its core, and why is it so incredibly, well, new and disruptive?
Right. At its heart, the new chronology argues that the conventional timeline of basically Middle Eastern and European history, the one we all learn, is fundamentally flawed, broken even. They propose that reliably documented human history only truly goes back to around AD 800, maybe AD 1000, and that most of the historical events we know about actually took place in a much more compressed period, roughly between AD 1000 and 1500.
So what happened to everything before that? Ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt.
That's the most controversial claim. They argue that ancient history, as we know it, is largely made up of phantom reflections. Phantom reflections of actual medieval events, duplicated and pushed back in time due to errors in dating, mistranslations, scribal errors, especially before printing standardized things.
Duplicated events.
They suggest, for example, that the history of the Roman Empire might be recorded multiple times under different names, creating the illusion of separate earlier civilizations. They point out that the oldest existing manuscripts of many classical works, like texts on ancient Rome or Greece, only date from the 11th to 15th centuries AD.
Implying they could have been written then, not just copied.
That's their suggestion, that the composition date might be much closer to the manuscript date than traditionally believed.
Wow. That sounds like a complete historical reset. And the claims go beyond just dating, right? They talk about a massive Russian horde empire. and re-identifying major historical figures like Jesus.
Yes, it gets even broader and more radical. Central to their rewritten history is this idea of a vast, unified empire ruling Eurasia during the Middle Ages, which they termed the Russian Horde, a kind of Slav-Turk empire. They suggest many seemingly distinct historical entities and figures were actually part of this single dominant power structure.
And Jesus.
Yes, they controversially suggest the historical Jesus is likely a composite figure, and the most probable prototype they claim is the Byzantine emperor Andronikos of Komnenos, who lived much later, from AD 1152 to 1185.
Emperor Andronikos is Jesus.
And even familiar place names like Rome or Jerusalem are seen as potentially flexible placeholders in historical texts, possibly referring to different cities or regions at different times, maybe even Constantinople or cities in Russia.
How do they even begin to justify these connections? What's the methodology?
It relies heavily on mathematical and statistical methods applied to historical texts. One is statistical correlation of texts. They measure, for instance, the amount of narrative space given to specific events or types of events in different chronicles, looking for unexpected similarities. Another is dynastic parallelism. They compare the lengths of reigns and the patterns of succession in supposedly unrelated dynasties, say Roman emperors and Egyptian pharaohs. If they find statistically similar patterns, they argue these aren't distinct dynasties, but are actually duplicated accounts of the same rulers, the same history, just misdated and mislabeled.
Comparing reign lengths statistically.
Right.
Okay. And they also attack the foundations of conventional dating, things like carbon dating and tree rings, right?
They do. That's crucial to their argument. They take a very critical stance on established methods like archaeological dating, dendrochronology, that's tree ring dating paleography, the study of ancient writing styles, and carbon dating. They argue these methods are either inherently non-exact, often produce contradictory results, or, most importantly, are dependent on the very traditional chronology they are trying to disprove. They see it as circular reasoning.
Circular reasoning. How so?
Well, for example, they might argue that carbon dates are often calibrated or interpreted based on assumed historical dates derived from traditional chronology. So if the chronology is wrong, the calibration is wrong. They highlight what they claim is a break or inconsistency in tree ring dating scales around 1000 AD. They criticize coin dating, numismatics, as also being circular because coin dates often rely on historical king lists.
So if these trusted methods are potentially flawed or circular, it opens a door, in their view, to radically different interpretations of the past.
Precisely. It forces you, at least, to question how much our historical understanding relies on a chain of assumptions and potentially interdependent dating methods.
This sounds, incredibly disruptive, doesn't even begin to cover it. How is this new chronology received by the actual academic community, by mainstream historians and scientists around the world?
Yet, stepping back to see the broader picture, the reception is, well, overwhelmingly negative. The new chronology is almost universally rejected by mainstream scholars. They typically categorize it firmly as pseudoscience.
Pseudoscience, strong words. What are the main criticisms?
Critics accuse Fomenko in particular of systematically altering data to fit his theories, of cherry-picking evidence, selecting only things that support his claims while ignoring vast amounts of contradictory information. They argue he creates artificial correlations through flawed statistical methods. Some have described his methods as, quote, the sleight-of-hand trickery of a David Copperfield. Yeah, and mainstream critics have labeled his work tendentious science, meaning it's biased, pushing an agenda rather than following rigorous empirical methods.
So near total rejection from academics.
Pretty much. However, despite this widespread academic rejection, the theory has gained significant popularity, especially in Russia. It's been championed by some prominent figures there, maybe most famously the former world chess champion Garry Kasparov.
Kasparov? Really?
Yes, and some observers have suggested its popularity might connect to or reflect a sort of renewed Russian imperial ideology, though that's an interpretation, of course.
Okay. So what we've explored today is this really audacious attempt to fundamentally rewrite history. Using these astronomical interpretations, hidden horoscopes in Revelation, planetary chariots in Ezekiel as a key but clearly highly debated tool. Our deep dive has really shown us how one theory, however controversial, challenges centuries of accepted chronology.
It absolutely does. And I think, regardless of whether one accepts the theory or not, it really compels us to think about how historical narratives get constructed in the first place, how evidence is interpreted, sometimes through specific lenses, and that complex interplay between science, belief, and the stories we ultimately tell ourselves about our past.
So, putting aside whether you find the new chronology itself convincing for a moment, What does exploring a theory like this make you wonder about the historical methods, the frameworks, the dating techniques that we usually just take for granted?